And welcome back, everybody, to another edition here of both the Auburn Undercover podcast and the Junkyard Dawgcast. Did one of these crossover episodes in the fall with our buddy Jordan Hill, and we've got another one here today. Jordan is joining us here on video, or rather, I am joining Jordan. Is probably it's probably the better way to put it, because Jordan is actually on location down in Destin for SEC spring meetings this week. Where as we record this here on Thursday evening, we got our first tangible bit of news, really seems like our only tangible bit of news from the event. And Jordan, I'll kind of let you take it away here. The headliner, though, is that they are sticking with an 8-game schedule for 2024. There was so much discourse about this and so much lead up, and I know you, just like everybody else, was like, oh, here, what could a 9-game schedule look like, and who could their, you covering Georgia, who could their permanent opponents be? And I did the same thing with Auburn, and here we are. It's going to be the same next year, but the biggest difference, though, is that they're eliminating divisions. So kind of walk us through the biggest news from today.
Right. I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. They're kind of what was funny the entire week with Greg Sankey. He had made a comment early in the week about wanting to land the plane this week. That was sort of the comparison he made. And to that point, I would say that now they're in a holding pattern. The SEC is in a holding pattern. They have gotten rid of divisions. You will have your top 2 teams, regardless. Just the top 2 teams as far as their conference record will go to Atlanta in 2024. They stick with the 8-game schedule and have said it's just for 2024. They will revisit it and have plans to decide if they want to stick with that 8-game schedule, if they want to move to the 9-game schedule beginning in 2025. Some of the topics that were discussed when it comes to this, why they are essentially waiting to make a long-term decision, was the uncertainty with the 12-team playoff that's going to be in 2024. The number of schools that have a number of non-conference games already scheduled, they would have to sort of rework, potentially rehash, because you would be adding another conference game to the schedule. It sounded like a lot of the athletic directors felt like there was too much uncertainty. Greg Byrne, Alabama's AD, said earlier this week, that they didn't have enough information. Now, how much more information they'll get in a year's time, I don't know. When it comes to this decision, I'll just read really briefly through the press release. In the 1-year schedule, the SEC teams will play 8 conference games plus, which we haven't mentioned so far in this podcast, 1 required opponent from the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, or major independent, essentially a Power 5 opponent in the 2024 season, which will be the first that Oklahoma and Texas will be SEC members. Pull a few of the quotes. I was in the room when Greg Sankey went through this and described what was coming. One of his quotes, quote, "Our long-term options are fully open for 25 and beyond. I'll just identify that since we're going to that single standings or single division schedule. You can understand that will be a focus. We will have continuing dialogue around the 8-team or 9-team schedule." I think the biggest thing, and Nathan, I'm sure we're going to get into this, when it comes to, really while we're doing this podcast together, the Georgia and Auburn piece of it, the prevailing thought was they would do a 1-7 model if they went with an 8-game schedule, which would be you would have 1 permanent opponent and the 7 essentially rotating. And obviously Auburn would have Alabama. As a result, Georgia would have Florida. And Greg Sankey was asked about this, so is this the 1-7 model? And he basically said, no, this is 8, as in, this is just the 8 games. And his quote about rivalries that I think if you're a Georgia fan or you're an Auburn fan that you should feel really good about. He said, quote, "We understand the importance of some of our really key games and our historic games, and we look forward to those continuing both in that 24 season and beyond." A little bit later, in another answer, he said, we're going to honor those traditional rivalries. So I think, they haven't spelled out what which teams are going to be playing which. They are really pushing, which mark your calendar, Nathan, because June 14th, you and I and all the other SEC beat writers are going to be watching SEC Network, because that's when they're going to announce who is playing who. They are not going to announce dates at that time, but they are going to announce the teams that are playing each other in the 2024 season. But Greg Sankey made it very, very clear that they care about these rivalries, and I think that was sort of a holdup with a lot of teams and a lot of presidents, athletic directors, that they didn't want to adopt that 1-7 model with the 8-game schedule because it would mean losing a lot of rivalries. And I think we both have written stuff and talked certainly on the board the last few days about the threat of the Deep South's oldest rivalry. Maybe not going away, but maybe not being an annual game. And I think that, based on that, I think the SEC took the right approach when it comes to rivalries. I want to get your perspective, Nathan, just because, kind of being here, you sort of get lost in all of it and trying to keep up with everything. But what is your immediate reaction to this plan for 2024? Essentially saying we're going to focus on 24 and revisit it, potentially when you have more information, potentially when you know a little bit more about the playoff. What was your immediate reaction when you heard that this was happening?
Well, we love to kick the can, don't we, folks? Especially in the SEC, especially in college football. I mean, I people were kind of talking this week, sort of memeing on the SEC, saying, the motto is it just means more, but I guess you've got to leave that in Destin. Maybe if you're not going to increase your you're not going to increase your schedule yet, and B, some of the coaches that made some headlines this week, complaining is probably too broad of a stroke there for comments from guys like Drinkwitz and Saban. I thought Kirby Smart had the best quote of the entire week when he was asked on Monday, I believe, about the schedule, and he said it's the most overrated conversation we've ever had. And his point is a good one, and that's kind of what I go back to when we look at this. It doesn't really matter as long as, and I'm glad you brought that up about the Deep South's oldest rivalry, as long as you preserve, or at least you do your best to preserve the rivalries and what's important to fan bases. Because I thought our buddy Justin Lee from the Opelika Auburn News, I thought he put it in a good way this week, talking about, Georgia Auburn. You can't lose that thing, because that's regardless of how successful Georgia has been against Auburn. Auburn hasn't won in that series since 2017. However, out of the however many, 13 to 15, who knows, whatever. But regardless of that, that's the game. That is one of the games on Auburn's schedule, like year in and year out. When that game's in Jordan-Hare Stadium, they will pack the thing out, and they care like crazy to win that game. The game last year in Athens was a complete blowout. Was a no contest, starting in like the second quarter, and still that was a really ravenous environment. So that's the thing to me, is making sure you're paying attention to the rivalries and doing your best to preserve those. That's what I was watching for from afar this week, because from little tidbits that I'm seeing here and there, like Texas A&M, that was sort of assumed to be a thing. Maybe not so solid, right? And maybe because of, like you were talking about, they're keeping the non-conference games intact. Like Auburn has Cal on the board for 2024. You have to play a Power 5 opponent in your non-conference. They said, I don't know who Georgia has for 24, but that kind of puts things in flux. Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, Bedlam is apparently going to be shelved for a little bit. At least for the next couple years, as Oklahoma starts to work its way into the SEC. And so from afar, that's not overly surprising. I do understand the playoff data. That was something that Hugh Freeze touched on, and of course, that Hugh Freeze touched on this week. It was sort of his whole focus of he was saying, I don't really care about 8 or 9. Like, again, it goes back to Kirby Smart's argument that you're going to play the same teams over the course of 4 years, which is, I think, that's a good model. When you can accomplish that, that's really good. But Hugh Freeze was saying, that's not really in my, realm right now. I don't really have much to say about that. But, something he does care about, if you're a team like Auburn, is how does that affect you in the playoff? If you are adding, because Auburn and the SEC, you routinely have one of the toughest schedules in the country, because you all play each other. And theoretically, Oklahoma and Texas are gonna get their act together, and at least one of them will probably be pretty good every once in a while, if not consistently. And so Auburn's going to keep having a top 5 schedule in the country. Georgia's going to keep having a top 10, top 15, whatever they usually average. Are you going to be penalized for going 9-3? if because you're playing an extra SEC game. And I thought Greg Sankey's way of sort of addressing that was pretty smart when he referenced college baseball and college softball and their regional seeding. And he said, look around the tournament in softball, look around the tournament in baseball. Auburn baseball, for example, really didn't catch on till the final 3 or 4 weeks of the season, and they end up being the number 13 overall seed and hosting a regional. So that's just kind of an example from him of we continually get the respect in the SEC as playing the toughest schedule, even if you have a couple losses here and there. Look at Alabama back in 2017. That hopefully if you're Auburn, that continues to reign true moving forward. But obviously Hugh Freeze has got to worry first about getting this team to a bowl game. But I do understand that. I do understand that sort of long-term thinking, and that's probably the same for all the coaches. So it is. I was kind of ready for something new, and I understand moving divisions off the table is new. But it seems to me, Jordan, I mean, at least you can touch on this a little bit. It seems to me like this was not known for sure. This wasn't concrete heading into the week, but all the reporting was that this was pretty expected. The fact that it was a unanimous vote also shows me that it was pretty expected. Did you get that feeling? And then B, is there the feeling that it will be 9 games eventually? They're just kind of kicking the can, or are they still exploring options?
Yeah, a lot of credit, I think, due to some of the national reporting leading into this week. I know specifically Sports Illustrated's Ross Dellinger had mentioned the very real possibility of what wound up happening, that they stuck with the 8-game schedule for 2024. And yeah, you could tell from talking to the different athletic directors, really more the athletic directors, I thought, than some of the coaches, that this was how it was trending. They were all playing their cards close to their vest. Saying we want to do what's best for the SEC. And you could tell there was sort of some of that timidness. And again, I really think what hit the nail on the head for me was Greg Byrne on, I believe that would have been Tuesday. I think it was Wednesday, actually. And he said, that he didn't think that the athletic directors had enough information, going back to your point, about wanting to get that data from the playoff and things like that. And especially too, I'm not sure that I mentioned this earlier, a big piece of this that is a big question mark is that deal with ESPN. I think it's like a 10-year $3 billion deal that was signed before Texas and Oklahoma joined the conference, and obviously that's a lot more money that would be on the line adding 2 brands like that. And I did want to mention too, as far as non-conference, Georgia has Clemson next year in addition to Georgia Tech. So I want to make sure I mention that. But as far as the long-term plan, I'm not entirely sure. I think if ESPN decides that they're willing to put up some more money, maybe renegotiate, then yeah, you get that 9-game. But I think, the way I stand right now, what I think winds up happening is they stick with 8 games. Nick Saban talked about it on Tuesday, the opening day of spring meetings. And, for a long time, he had been a proponent of going to 9 games, and he's kind of backed off that. And he said a big piece of that was that more teams have been willing, more non-conference teams, I should say, have been willing to schedule Alabama and do those home and homes. And, I think his argument was essentially, why would you trade a marquee non-conference game for another SEC game when, you will get some big matchups if you do that, but you're also going to get, some Alabama Vanderbilts or, some I'm trying to think of just random like Auburn, South Carolina. You can get some good games, but you might get some it's like, well, would you rather watch that or would you rather watch Auburn play like Florida State? So I think based on all the data I've gathered this week, I think the SEC is going to stay put in the long run to at 8 games. But I think that it's sort of on the onus, especially of the top teams in the conference, to schedule really, really good marquee non-conference games. And Alabama's done that. Georgia, like I mentioned, has done that. It's got Clemson. They mentioned during that press conference next year LSU plays USC. I believe Notre Dame plays Texas A&M. And I think if you look at it from a fan perspective, I understand wanting to go to 9 games. I'm a proponent of them doing the 9 games and go into a 3-6 model where you have those 3 permanent rivals. But if you're not going to do that, I could get behind saying, okay, we're going to stick with 8 games, but we're going to play games that maybe not maybe are not necessarily playoff level. But if you're giving, Georgia's got Ohio State on the schedule. It's in 2031, so that's still a ways away. But they play Clemson several times. They've got Florida State, Louisville. If you play games that are of interest, I think that that's okay. And I've seen, and I knew, and I think everyone in the room when this was announced understood this was going to come, that there was going to be a lot of criticism for a conference that says, it wants to be at the forefront and sort of lead by example, that they decided to stay pat and only playing 8 games when a whole lot of Power Five conferences are playing 9 games a year. But the SEC can make the argument that it's the SEC. They've won the last 4 national championships and 5 of the last 6, and I've had a stranglehold on college football. Especially when it comes to winning national championships for the better part of the 21st century. So I think they can make the argument that we can do it this way because of the caliber that we have. We don't necessarily have to play 9 games to prove ourselves among the other Power Five schools. So that's sort of my take on that. What do you think about sort of that thinking, if it does stick with 8 long term, especially if we say, all right, 8 games, you can get marquee non-conference games consistently, especially with the teams that in theory will be in the race to make the playoff most years.
Yeah, I mean, you make an excellent point about the non-conference, and I think that was an important stipulation for them to make when they brought this announcement forward, because everybody's sort of tired of the same shellacking that the top teams are going to give to buy-in games, or whatever you want to call them, cash grab games that they bring in small opponents and beat them down. That's still going to exist moving forward, it looks like, but I'm with you that there is that, as long as you can balance the emphasis on good non-conference matchups, which when you were talking, all of us kind of thought with the SEC expansion and with Big Ten expansion on the way, like Auburn's got UCLA on the schedule, that in the future, that remains to be interesting because they're moving conferences. They've got Baylor on the schedule in the future. I think everybody sort of thought, the Big 12's changing. It's like, this whole thing's going to blow up. Everybody's future schedules are just going to get completely wiped, and we're going to have to start from ground zero. Now that we're in it, and now that the debates are actually happening and people are formulating details, it's clear that that's not necessarily the case. Like, we can get and that's why it was interesting to me, and that's why it made a lot of sense for them to go with, people are kind of calling it an interim. The interim schedule is like, and that's why it makes sense. As much as I'm with you, like I like the 3-6 format a lot. I like the 3 permanent rivals. But if you're gonna go, I do understand sort of. I know I said kicking the can earlier, and I do like to clown on college football for doing that often. But it makes sense when you're just sort of looking ahead and you've got all of these matchups. You mentioned so many of those for Georgia, and I've mentioned some of the future ones for Auburn. That's not even mentioning the rest of the conference. Now 14 teams in the league. Think about how many future matchups, how many future schedules you have to balance, and what that means, and as conference realignment changes. And so, I think it was a sensible decision overall for the league. And as much as I was a proponent of 3-6, it's sort of, to me, like the playoff argument of expansion, where 3 permanent rivals, everybody's gonna now say, oh well, who could the 4th one be? And now that I hesitate to say 2 permanent rivals with this system, because obviously they're not, it's not a 1-7. It doesn't have a label, if I'm understanding that correctly from Greg Sankey. And so while there's not going to be permanent rivals per se, it definitely seems like they're putting an emphasis on that. People are always going to say, oh well, they need more. They need another rival. If it does end up going to 2, I would assume that'd be Florida and Auburn for Georgia. People would still want Tennessee. If it's obviously Georgia and Alabama are the biggest ones for Auburn, but they've got great history with a team like LSU, and people want to see that rivalry renewed with Florida. And so, to go back on Kirby Smart's point of it is the same over a 4-year cycle. I think that thinking and kind of sticking with that line of thinking is the most important thing here, because if you're considering a student athlete who comes in as a freshman on average, especially now with all the grad transfers, and I guess the COVID years will be gone soon, but a guy is on average probably going to play 3.5 years, 4 years probably at an institution. And so getting to move around the league, and also for fan bases, I think that is important as well. Like, giving them the opportunity. Like there's some crazy thing about, was it Georgia and Texas A&M? Was that the one either last year or a couple years ago, like where they haven't played even though they've been in the league since 2012? It's just crazy.
Yeah, so Georgia's never played at College Station. They played, I believe, Texas A&M came to Georgia, and I think that was 2019. But Georgia has never been to College Station,
and that is complete. I mean, that's just completely ridiculous. Like they've been in the league since 2012. So as long as we can try to fix those things, I guess I'm all right with it. Like you mentioned, Jordan, June 14th is when is what they're going to have to keep an eye on. In terms of, always seems like we're going to have these big summer announcements every year moving forward. We had the COVID one that was like early September, where we all had to park in front of the TV. Obviously, last year's was pretty normal, and now we've got one in the middle of the summer. I'm trying to look here, Jordan, to see if there's anything else we missed. I don't know how much you were privy to this. You probably were. The field storming changes. I don't know how much you can speak on that. That's been another big topic, as you sort of touch on what the national topics are at something like spring meetings, and for any conference. This doesn't just apply to the SEC, but we saw some ugly stuff with this. Primarily the Tennessee, Alabama stuff comes to mind. There's other stuff I'm not thinking about, but safety needs to be improved in terms of field storming, and it seems like they've at least got a couple ideas that they're introducing coming this next season.
Right. And before I get into that, wasn't there a situation too with Auburn, Arkansas, in my basketball?
You are correct. Yeah. My brain was not on basketball, but you're exactly right. Bruce Pearl mentioned that it was some of his players sort of got bumped into. It was just a bad situation overall, because when the fans are allowed to come on the court or the field immediately, there was a dunk, the guy dropped his feet down, and fans were on the floor immediately. Like there was no time for players to exit the court or anything like that. So yeah, you're exactly right. That did get some headlines as well. So yeah, it seems like they're going to make some changes to that.
Right. Yes, they have increased the fines when it comes to field storming. The for a first offense, the school's going to be fined $100,000. That's double what it was in the past. Second offense, $250,000. I believe it might have been 100,000 before. Third offense, $500,000. There were a lot of ideas thrown around in the last few weeks about this. There had been a committee, a 3-man committee, I believe, of Greg Byrne, Kentucky Athletic Director Mitch Barnhart, and Georgia Athletic Director Josh Brooks, that was sort of exploring what they could do to prevent field storming. And there were some pretty drastic ideas thrown around. I mean, essentially, if, say, Georgia and Auburn played, Auburn wins and storms the field, the idea was thrown out there that, well, the next time that those two teams play and Auburn was supposed to be the home team, well, they could lose home field advantage. And I don't think anybody was for that. Based on what they've done, looks like the upping of the financial fines was the way they decided to go. And I think it made the most sense, because I don't think anyone was going to support how much money you would lose and just the straight up home field advantage you would lose if one of those situations played out. So that was also introduced tonight. You can understand that it was kind of secondary as far as the conversation when it compares to the schedule. But also, I think it's really important. And I get why there is a lot of concern. You don't want somebody getting hurt. You don't want a situation where players are scared to get off the field. And I want to shout out David Ubben from The Athletic. They were talking after the fact, and he mentioned what he thought was a really good idea, was something that the Big 12 has implemented in the past, where they essentially go to the film and look at how did a certain team, the stadium security, handle a post game, handle a field storming, and basically judge that if we should, put forth a fine. So yeah, it's going to be something to watch as far as field storming. There's no right answer, because, as was pointed out this week, you're not going to have a student body, get ready to go, and someone stand up and say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is going to cost our school, $500,000." Like that's not going to happen. But you obviously want to keep people safe, and especially, we know from going on the field to try to get to post game press conferences, just generally that's hard. And then when you get in this situation, like say after an Iron Bowl where there's a field storming, it gets tight, and definitely dangerous. So I get why it's a point of emphasis, something that I want to try to also taking away makes college football so basketball as well in those situations where you have court storming.
Yeah, I'm with you where, I think back to, I think I tweeted it out when the game ended, but Tennessee beats Alabama, and like the CBS aerial shot of a packed Neyland Stadium just like flooding with orange on the field and the fireworks going off. Like that's awesome. That's what you like. That's what you want if you're a college football fan. But to play devil's advocate, like you said, having been in those situations, like I think you're probably referencing the 19 Iron Bowl. Like I remember trying to get off the field there, and like, I mean, it was fun, and like, don't get me wrong, it was awesome. Like it was definitely a cool experience. But there are inebriated 20-year-olds sprinting straight at you, and they do not care if they run into you. So I can't even imagine being an opposing player. And so yeah, like you said, there were drastic measures tossed around a few months ago. I remember them talking about bowl game reduction, scholarship reduction, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, you want to take this thing seriously. But I think my idea, if anyone will ever listen to it, I had an idea for the clock to make use of the scoreboard and be like, all right, you give the PA announcers like, we're gonna put 7 minutes on the clock, giving the other team time. You shake hands for a minute, and then you make your way into the locker room, and then it's a party. Then you don't have to worry about the other team. You don't have to worry about the away team. It's just your own. So if there's an issue with your home team, like that's on you. It's your fans. It's your stadium. I don't know if that's ever going to happen. David Ovens' idea.
I was just going to say, I think that is a good, because that is bringing at least a little bit of organization. And if it's understood for the students, like, all right, we got to wait this long. That's the rule. I mean, we've waited through literally an entire game. I don't think that's a bad idea. I don't know if it will ever, I don't know if we're going to get any traction. Maybe we can get some of the, some people on 247 to kind of get the ball rolling. But I like that idea because, you can only do so much here. And again, I get one why they decided to up the money, but also two why they didn't do something extremely drastic like where you could lose a home game, because I don't think that's going to curb it, and I don't think that's that's not going to have the effects they're hoping it would have.
Yeah, it's going to end up not communicated well to fans, and then they're going to do it, and then you're going to lose a home game, and that is going to be tons of revenue loss for your conference. I understand a penalty, but like at the end of the day, the revenue, not that money's everything, but also money's everything. Like the revenue that you're going to lose from one of those games is going to definitely be more than any penalty you could possibly like conjure up for it. So I anticipate this is going to be a conversation for the next decade plus. Like every time you talk to somebody about field storming, like my parents both went to Alabama, they are Alabama fans. And so they are on the receiving end of those most of the time. And so they have a certain opinion about it. If you're a Tennessee fan who, marched down to the Tennessee River and threw the goalpost in the water, like you're going to have a differing opinion about it. Auburn fans are going to have a differing opinion. So like, it's just, I anticipate them continuing. This will be in flux for the next little bit, but
and two, if you're the Tennessee, I believe it was the president, you have an opinion. If you remember, he lit up a cigar and was like, "We'll pay the fine." And you know what? It was worth it for Tennessee that night.
Oh, it's absolutely worth it. Yeah, but yeah, of course, and safety, of course, ends up being the number one thing here, and so that's obviously what the SEC is trying to pinpoint. Jordan, if you do not have anything else that you want to get into, I don't know if you've got anything else on your checklist. There is one. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Nate.
I was gonna say there is a comment here that I wanted to get to on YouTube. It's either your YouTube or ours. That says, would there be a vote for the top two teams? Basically, this is talking about the divisions being eliminated. there's bound to be ties among the top two teams. Number one is clearly the best, maybe 12-0, but the next two have one loss. I mean, I think it's going to retain most of the tiebreaker scenarios, like 2-11-1 teams. It's most prevalent in basketball. You like go from top down, and that's how they seed. That's why like there's weird seeding sometimes in the SEC tournament. So I don't know the last time we had an actual 2 and 3 in a league like be decided by a coin flip. They've got several measures. You can go to the SEC's website. Honestly, if you look up SEC football tiebreakers, even now with divisions, there's a bunch of stuff in place. So the odds of that happening are extremely slim. Would be entertaining, but yeah, they've got stuff for that. So
Yeah, I think it would be, like you said, pretty straightforward. They've had situations. I mean, I can think in both divisions where you've had years where the top teams that have gone on tiebreakers. There was a run there in the mid 2000s where it was like Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida would trade losses, and there would be three teams with one loss, and then you had to go through the tiebreakers. I think that happened at least once. So yeah, Nathan. I think the only other thing I could think of is just for each of us to give kind of a parting thought on the schedule thing. My biggest thing, I get it, which we kind of talked about, and my biggest point was really to preserve the rivalry. I really, as a fan of college football, would have been very upset if they sort of threw games like Georgia and Auburn to the wayside it. Like that, those are the games that matter. I think of so many people who grew up in families where they got cousins that are Auburn fans and they're Georgia fans, or they work with someone who's a big Auburn fan, but they're a Georgia fan. Their neighbor's an Auburn fan. That's what makes this sport. As long as they stick to their word of saying, we're gonna really keep these rivalries at the forefront and make sure that they matter and they continue. I'm okay with it. I do understand why there's frustration that they're not moving to a 9-game schedule. But as long as you keep those rivalries, I'm sure, I'll have things to point out and quibbles to make. But above all else, I think you've got to preserve those rivalries, as many of those rivalries as you can.
yeah, completely agree. That's the name of the game here, because at the end of the day, the best teams in the league are still going to be the best teams in the league. And like the teams that are winning championships, both on a conference and national level, are going to continue to be the same teams moving forward. I mean, that's from decade to decade. And so, what is the great equalizer in college sports and why it's different from other sports is like you talked about, is rivalries. I got kind of scared today, like when I saw, I can't remember what it was in response to, but it's Texas and Texas A&M fans talking, like we were talking about earlier, like that looked to be so concrete. That was something where, people were like, oh, great, they're going to get to play again. They're in the same conference. Doesn't that make sense? Of course it would make sense, but at the moment, it's not a guarantee. And it was some Texas fans saying like, like that, that rivalry's kind of stale now because they haven't played. And it was like, maybe it's like Texas A&M fans talking about how nasty Texas fans are and how they don't have any desire. And I was thinking to myself, I do not want Auburn or Georgia to ever get to that point. Like if they stopped playing for some reason on an annual basis, and then you looped back around and their fan bases were, I granted, I can't ever see that happening, but you loop back around to their fan bases and they're like, they're a little bit more lethargic about it. And they're like, maybe we could play them again, maybe not. That's a nightmare scenario. You want the bloodthirsty nature of the rivalry going always. And so another thing, Jordan, that I wanted to just kind of mention, I don't have the means to, and I'm scared of how it would happen to my internet if I tried to do this right now. But like, with them going to just the two best teams, how much does that change? Let's look at the past 15 SEC title games. Like, would they be different? How many of them would be different? My guess is not many. My guess is most of the time the two best teams are, number one from both the East and the West. So I mean, that's another thing that's going to be interesting, is how much that really changes the dynamic of the conference. Don't think it will. I don't think, if you look back on the past however many years it's been since they started playing the SEC title game. But that is interesting. That might be something I go do when we hit stop, is see, who maybe had a better record as the number 2 team in the East. They had a better record than number 1 in the West. I doubt it happened very often, but it probably has, if at least a handful of times.
I would look around those 2010s. It felt like the West was so much stronger. that it might have happened some then. But like you said, write you a story on that, Nathan. Get some sweet summer content out of this news.
Jordan, we love the summer content, and that's why spring meetings is great. Even though it says spring, it's June, so I call it summer. SEC summer meetings.
It's like the fall classic, in November with the World Series. You just kind of roll with it.
I don't even know. Summer has not started yet, right? Summer doesn't start.
I don't
for
think
a while.
so. That's what I was going to say. I think it is surprisingly late when summer is officially in full go.
That's BS. Summer for me now is summer as a kid was obviously summer break. Summer for me now is when all of the college students leave campus and leave the town, and it becomes very sleepy and quiet, and it's amazing for like 3 months. You know the feeling. That's summer.
Oh, yeah.
That's summer for me now. Gotcha. All right, Jordan. Well, I think we'll go ahead and call it there. We appreciate everybody for listening. We appreciate those from the Junkyard Dawgcast and the Auburn Undercover podcast. And we definitely appreciate Jordan, to all of our Auburn listeners, for his dispatch from the SEC spring meetings, where it was extremely eventful. Well, at the same time, not a ton happened. You kind of had both happening at the same time, but definitely a lot to chew on. And of course, June 14th will be that 2024 schedule announced. So be sure to subscribe, guys, if you enjoyed it. Dogs 24/7 is where Jordan is. Of course, we're over at auburnundercover.com. We will see you guys later. Everybody have a good weekend.